Maria had always loved the land. Ever since she was a little girl, she had run barefoot through the fields, helping her husband with planting and harvesting. The smell of fresh soil, the sound of birds at dawn, and the gentle rustle of the crops in the wind had always brought her peace. She had shared this love with her husband, Aaron, who had been kind, hard-working, and full of laughter. Together, they had dreamed of a life on this land, raising a family, and nurturing the farm that had been in Aaron's family for generations. But life had a way of changing its plans. One rainy evening, when the sky was dark and heavy with clouds, Aaron fell ill unexpectedly. Despite the doctor's efforts, he passed away, leaving Maria alone in a world that suddenly seemed empty and cold. The farm, once full of hope and laughter, now felt quiet and lifeless. The fields that had been a source of joy now reminded her of the absence of the man she loved most. Every corner of the house, every tool in the barn, every pathway through the crops carried memories of Aaron, and each memory hurt as much as it comforted her. Maria tried to keep herself busy, thinking that work might ease her grief. She tended the animals, watered the crops, and repaired fences, but the effort seemed never-ending. She would rise with the sun, her hands raw from labor, and fall asleep exhausted, only to wake and start again. Yet, no matter how hard she worked, the threat of losing the land loomed over her like a dark cloud. Aaron's relatives, who had never shown much interest before, began to make their intentions clear. They claimed that the land should pass to them, saying that a young widow could not manage it alone. They did not consider the years Maria had spent working alongside Aaron, nor the knowledge she had gained about every inch of the property. To them, she was simply a vulnerable woman who could be pushed aside. The council in the nearby town had recently tightened rules about inheritance, especially regarding unmarried women managing land. Maria had heard whispers of widows losing their property simply because there was no husband to represent them officially. She had no family nearby to protect her, no wealthy friends to speak for her, and no legal expertise to fight complicated paperwork. Each day brought new letters, notices, and calls from lawyers and relatives, each demanding her surrender or pressuring her to sell the land. Maria felt trapped, as though the life she had built with Aaron was slipping away despite all her effort and love. She remembered the evening when she first realized the seriousness of the situation. Sitting alone in the small living room, the fire crackling softly in the hearth, she read the letter from the council. The words seemed to blur together: if not legally married, widow may not retain sole ownership of inherited property. Her heart sank. She clutched the paper, trying to imagine any way out. She thought of selling the land, but the thought was unbearable. This farm was her connection to Aaron, to their shared dreams, and to a life that she could never rebuild elsewhere. To give it up would be like letting go of his memory entirely. Tears came, unbidden, but Maria wiped them quickly. She had always been strong, or at least she had always believed she needed to be. The farm required her strength, her courage, and her determination. She had faced storms, failed crops, and the hardships of farm life before, but nothing had prepared her for this: the feeling that the very ground beneath her feet was slipping away. Maria knew she could not allow the land to fall into the hands of relatives who only saw it as a source of profit. She had to find a solution, and she had to find it fast. As days passed, Maria began to consider options she had never thought she would. Marriage. The very thought made her stomach twist. She was not ready, not yet, and certainly not for the sake of the land. Yet, she also realized that her pride could not save her farm. The law required a husband, someone who could legally represent her and secure her ownership. She had no family, no wealthy uncle, no trusted friend with influence. If she wanted to keep her home, her fields, and her memories, she would have to find a way to comply with the rules. Her mind wandered to the people in the village. Some were kind, some were curious, and some were silent observers of her struggles. One name kept coming up quietly, almost in whispers: Elias. A farmer who lived on the edge of the village, known for being quiet and hard-working. People respected him, but no one knew much about him. He didn't socialize much, rarely attended gatherings, and kept to himself. Yet he was reliable, skilled, and honest. Maria remembered seeing him in the fields, working from dawn until dusk, tending to his crops and animals with a quiet dedication. There was something steady about him, something safe, though she had never spoken to him directly. The idea formed slowly in her mind. Could he help her? Not in friendship, not in a personal connection, but in the practical sense required by the law. A husband on paper, someone to secure her ownership of the land while she continued to manage it herself. It was unconventional, risky, and felt strange to even imagine. But desperation has a way of nudging the mind toward impossible ideas. She weighed her options carefully, considering the potential risks, the social judgments, and the uncertainty of asking a stranger for such an unusual favor. Every evening, Maria would sit by the window, looking out at the fields. The golden light of sunset touched the tops of the crops, and she could almost hear Aaron's laughter in the rustle of the leaves. She wondered what he would have said about her plan. Would he have supported her determination, or worried for her heart? The thought both comforted and pained her. Yet, as the nights grew longer and the letters from the council more urgent, Maria knew that she could not wait any longer. The farm could not survive on memory alone, it needed action. Maria decided that she would speak to Elias. She would explain her situation, her loss, and the need for a legal arrangement that could protect the land. She did not know if he would agree. She did not know if he would understand. But she knew she had to try. Hope, fragile as it was, needed a chance to grow. For the first time in weeks, a small flicker of determination replaced the fear in her chest. She was not giving up, not yet, not on the land, not on the life she had fought so hard to build. As she prepared to visit Elias the next morning, Maria felt a mixture of anxiety and resolve. She dressed simply, tied her hair back, and took the short walk through the fields to his home. The sun was rising, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, and the birds chirped softly as if encouraging her forward. She took a deep breath, clutching her bag of documents and letters, and knocked on his door. The sound echoed in the quiet morning, and she waited, heart pounding, for the man who might hold the key to saving everything she had lost and everything she had loved. When Elias opened the door, she was struck by his calm presence. His eyes were clear, his hands strong from years of labor, and there was an honesty in his gaze that immediately put her at ease. Maria hesitated, then spoke, explaining her situation carefully, trying to convey both her desperation and her respect. She could see his expression change slightly, not surprise, not judgment, but thoughtfulness. He listened without interrupting, his silence as steady as the earth beneath their feet. By the time Maria finished speaking, Elias nodded slowly. There were no immediate promises, no grand speeches, only the quiet understanding that she had hoped for. It was not an answer yet, but it was the first step, the first sign that perhaps there was a way to protect the land, and perhaps, a way to find stability again. Maria felt a cautious hope stir within her, a fragile but persistent light in the midst of grief and uncertainty. She thanked him and left, walking back through the fields with her heart a little lighter. The wind whispered through the crops, and for the first time in weeks, Maria felt that maybe, just maybe, she could face the future whatever it might hold with courage. The road ahead would not be easy, but she had taken the first step, and that step, as small as it seemed, was enough to keep her moving forward. The morning after Maria's visit to Elias's home, she could hardly sleep. Her mind kept replaying the moment she had spoken her heart out to him. She had told him about the risk of losing her land, about her fear, about her husband's memory, and about the impossible choice the council had forced on her. Elias had listened quietly, his eyes never leaving hers, his silence heavy but not dismissive. That silence now stayed with her. What did it mean? Was it rejection, or was it simply his way of thinking? Maria rose early, as usual, tending to her animals before the sun had fully risen. She milked the cow, fed the chickens, and checked the crops, but her mind was elsewhere. Every sound of the morning, the bleating of goats, the fluttering of birds, the rustle of leaves seemed distant. Her thoughts circled around Elias. Would he agree? Would he refuse? She told herself not to hope too much, but hope, once planted, was hard to uproot. 2 days passed, and Maria heard nothing. She tried to convince herself that silence was better than a direct no. Perhaps he needed time. Perhaps he had his own burdens she could not see. But on the 3rd day, as she worked in her small garden, she noticed a figure walking slowly toward her fields. Her heart skipped a beat. It was Elias. He came without hurry, carrying nothing but a small bag slung across his shoulder. Maria wiped her hands nervously on her apron and stepped forward to meet him. He greeted her with a simple nod, the way he greeted most people. She waited, unsure of how to begin, when at last he spoke in his low, calm voice. "I've thought about what you said," Elias told her. "It is not a small thing you ask. But I will help you." The words were simple, yet they landed on Maria's heart like a blessing. Relief washed over her, and for a moment, she felt the heavy burden on her shoulders lift just a little. She thanked him sincerely, her voice trembling with both gratitude and nervousness. Elias did not smile, but there was a softness in his eyes that reassured her. They sat on a wooden bench under the shade of an old tree near the house. Maria laid out the papers, letters, and documents she had received from the council. She explained how the law required her to have a husband in order to secure her ownership of the farm. She told him about the relatives pressing her to sell, about the council's deadlines, and about her fear of losing everything. Elias listened silently, nodding once in a while. When she finished, he asked only one question. "And after this? When the land is safe?" Maria hesitated. She had thought of this but had no clear answer. "We can decide then," she said softly. "This does not have to be forever. I only need help to keep what is mine, what belonged to my husband. After that, if you wish, we can part ways." Elias nodded again, accepting her answer without further words. He did not seem curious about her life beyond what she had shared, nor did he seem concerned with the whispers such an arrangement might cause in the village. His calmness both unsettled and comforted her. She had expected questions, doubts, or at least conditions. Instead, she received quiet agreement. The following week, Maria and Elias visited the council together. They signed the required documents, their names placed side by side as husband and wife. Maria felt her heart pounding as she held the pen, the weight of what they were doing heavy on her chest. It was not a real marriage, not one born of love or affection, but it carried the same power in the eyes of the law. The officials congratulated them, and Maria forced a polite smile. Inside, her emotions twisted in confusion. She was grateful, yes. Relieved, certainly. But there was also a strange emptiness, as though she had crossed into a life she had never imagined for herself. Elias, on the other hand, remained steady, his expression unchanged, as though the entire matter was nothing more than a task completed. When they returned to her home, Elias placed his bag in the corner of the small living room. "I'll stay here for now," he said simply. Maria nodded. She had expected this. If their marriage was to appear real, they needed to live together. Yet the thought of sharing her home, her quiet sanctuary of memories, with another person made her uneasy. She told herself she would adjust. This was necessary. The days that followed were strange. Elias was a man of few words, moving through the house quietly, almost like a shadow. He woke early, worked in the fields without being asked, and fixed things Maria had long ignored: the squeaky door, the broken fence, the leaking bucket. He did it all silently, leaving Maria both surprised and uncertain. She had not asked for his help beyond the papers, yet he worked as though the farm was his own responsibility. At first, Maria tried to avoid him. She would work in the garden while he worked in the barn. She would cook meals alone, leaving his portion on the table without asking if he was hungry. But slowly, she noticed small gestures that made her heart soften. When she came in after a long day, she would find fresh firewood stacked neatly by the hearth. When her hands were too tired to knead the dough, Elias quietly took over, his strong hands working the flour with practiced ease. When she forgot to cover the chicken coop one night, she found it done in the morning without a word. It was not kindness expressed in words, but in actions quiet, steady, reliable. Maria began to see him differently. Yet, the silence between them weighed heavily. She wanted to thank him, to talk to him, to understand who this man was beyond his calm eyes and strong hands. But every time she tried, his answers were short. When she asked about his farm, he replied, "It grows." When she asked if he had family, he said, "Not here." When she asked what he enjoyed, he only shrugged. Maria wondered if she had made a mistake. How could she live with a man she could not truly know? But then she remembered the desperation that had driven her to this decision. She had not sought companionship, she had sought survival. And in that, Elias had given her exactly what she needed. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of gold and orange, Maria sat by the window, staring at the fields. Elias entered quietly, carrying a basket of vegetables he had harvested. He placed it on the table and turned to leave, but something in Maria's heart made her speak. "Thank you," she said softly. He stopped, glanced at her, and for the first time since he had moved in, she thought she saw the faintest trace of a smile, small, fleeting, but real. It was enough to make her believe that perhaps beneath his silence, there was more to him than she could yet see. Maria went to bed that night with a strange feeling in her heart. The farm was safe for now, the documents signed, the land secure. But the arrangement she had made was not just about paper anymore. A quiet man had stepped into her life, bringing with him a silence that was both unsettling and comforting. She could not predict what the future held, but one thing was certain, her story was no longer hers alone. Life began to take on a strange rhythm in the days after Elias moved into Maria's home. At first, Maria felt awkward, as though she were living with a stranger who had stepped into her private world. She still caught herself expecting Aaron's voice, Aaron's footsteps, or Aaron's laughter around the house. But instead, there was Elias, quiet, steady, and present in his own way. The silence between them was sometimes heavy, but it was never hostile. Elias was not a man who wasted words, yet his actions spoke for him. He was always working, if not in the fields, then repairing something around the house. Maria discovered things she had stopped noticing: the loose hinge on the back door, the broken handle of the cupboard, the fence with gaps big enough for goats to slip through. Elias fixed them all without being asked. It was as if he saw the world through the eyes of someone who wanted to leave it in better shape than he found it. One evening, Maria came in from tending the cows and found a basket of fresh produce on the kitchen table. The vegetables were cleaned, sorted, and neatly arranged, as if someone had gone out of their way to make her life easier. She stared at the basket, puzzled. She had been too busy to harvest that day. Elias had done it, and he had done it quietly, without a word, without even letting her see. At first, Maria felt unsettled. She had grown used to doing everything alone since Aaron's passing. To have someone step in and share her burden felt strange, almost uncomfortable. But as days passed, she began to see that Elias was not taking over, he was supporting her. He never interfered with her choices or tried to control the way she ran the farm. He simply added his strength to hers, in silence. Meals became the only time they truly sat together. Maria would cook simple food: bread, stew, or rice with vegetables, and place it on the table. Elias would join her, bow his head briefly in quiet respect for the meal, and then eat. At first, the silence during those meals felt heavy, but over time, it became something else: comfortable, even peaceful. They did not need to fill every moment with words. Sometimes, Maria found herself listening to the crackle of the fire, the sound of spoons against bowls, and realizing that silence, when shared, could be a kind of companionship. Still, Maria was curious about him. She wanted to know who Elias really was, beyond the quiet farmer the village whispered about. She wanted to understand why he agreed to her unusual request, why he lived such a solitary life, and what he carried in his heart. Yet, every time she tried to ask, his answers were short, as though words were things he kept locked away. One evening, Maria tried again. They were sitting on the porch after a long day of work. The sun was setting, painting the sky in colors of orange and pink, and the fields glowed softly in the fading light. Maria turned to Elias and asked, "Why did you agree to help me? You didn't have to. You could have said no." Elias looked out at the fields for a long moment before answering. "Because you asked," he said simply. Maria frowned slightly. "That's all." He nodded. His answer was honest, but it left her with more questions than before. She wanted to press further, but she also sensed that pushing him too much might make him retreat even more. So, she let the silence settle between them once again. In the following weeks, Maria began to notice little details about Elias that made her think. He had a way of studying the land, as though every blade of grass and every drop of rain carried meaning. He worked with patience, never rushing, never complaining. If something broke, he fixed it with care. If the weather was harsh, he endured it without a word. There was a steadiness about him that made Maria feel both secure and curious. She also noticed how the villagers started to look at her differently. Before, they had pitied her as a young widow, struggling alone. Some had whispered about her chances of survival, others had wondered aloud whether she would sell the land. But now, with Elias by her side, the whispers changed. People saw a household with two strong hands, two figures working side by side. They no longer questioned her ability to keep the farm. And while Maria did not care much for gossip, she felt a quiet relief knowing that appearances were working in her favor. Still, the adjustment was not without its challenges. There were times when Maria felt the weight of living with someone she barely knew. She sometimes missed the warmth of conversations, the laughter she had once shared with Aaron. She would glance at Elias, wishing he would speak more, wishing she could understand what went on behind his calm eyes. But then she reminded herself this was not a marriage of love. It was an arrangement, one born of necessity, and it was unfair to expect more than what Elias had agreed to give. One rainy afternoon, Maria found herself struggling with a heavy sack of grain. She had tried to lift it alone, her pride telling her she didn't need help. But as she staggered under the weight, Elias appeared silently at her side. Without a word, he took the sack from her and carried it easily into the barn. Maria stood there, soaked by the rain, watching him with a strange mix of emotions. Gratitude, yes. But also something else, something she couldn't yet name. That night, as she lay in bed listening to the sound of the rain against the roof, Maria thought of Elias. His silence, his strength, his quiet way of caring. He was not Aaron, and he never would be. But perhaps he was something else, something steady, something dependable. The following morning, she decided to do something she hadn't done since he moved in. She cooked breakfast with extra care: warm bread, honey, and fresh milk. When Elias came in from the fields, muddy boots and all, she placed the food before him and smiled. "Eat," she said softly. He looked at her for a moment, then nodded. For the first time, Maria thought she saw a flicker of something in his eyes: surprise, perhaps even appreciation. They ate together in silence, but this silence felt lighter, warmer. Over the next few weeks, their rhythm grew smoother. They worked together in the fields, shared meals, and slowly, without realizing it, became a team. Maria still longed to know more about him, but she began to accept that Elias spoke through his actions. Each time he repaired something, carried a heavy load for her, or left a basket of vegetables on the table, he was speaking in his own language. And though it was not the language she was used to, Maria was learning to understand it. One evening, After a long day of planting, Maria sat outside, watching the stars appear one by one in the night sky. Elias sat beside her, his usual calm presence steady and quiet. After a long silence, Maria spoke. "Maybe this isn't so strange, after all," she said softly. Elias turned his head slightly, as though considering her words, and then gave a small nod. It wasn't much, but to Maria, it was enough. For the first time since Aaron's death, she felt that her world was no longer only about loss. It was about endurance, about unexpected beginnings, and about finding comfort in places she had never thought to look. The arrangement she had made out of desperation was slowly turning into something else, something she couldn't yet define, but something real nonetheless. The days slipped into weeks, and the weeks into months. Maria had grown used to the presence of Elias in her home, though she still did not know him well. He remained the same quiet man, working hard, speaking little, and never drawing attention to himself. Yet, little by little, Maria began to notice how deeply he was becoming a part of her daily life. There were times when she almost forgot the original reason for their arrangement. At dawn, she would wake and find Elias already outside, feeding the animals or checking the fences. At noon, they would share a meal, simple but warm, and then return to the fields. By evening, he would carry firewood, and she would prepare supper. Without ever saying it aloud, they had fallen into a pattern of living together, a partnership of sorts. But Maria's heart was restless. She felt a mix of gratitude and curiosity toward Elias, and sometimes even a quiet comfort that she didn't want to admit. Yet, she also felt the distance between them, an invisible wall made of silence and secrets. She knew so little about him. Where had he come from? Why did he live alone before? Why did he never speak of his past? One evening, the weight of these questions became too heavy to keep inside. Maria was sitting by the fire, mending a torn shirt, while Elias sat nearby, oiling a farming tool. The room was quiet except for the sound of the firewood crackling. She hesitated, but finally gathered the courage to ask. "Elias," she said softly, "can I ask you something?" He looked up from his work, his expression calm, waiting. "Why did you really agree to this arrangement with me?" she continued. "I mean, it is not an easy thing, to step into someone's life this way. You had no reason to help me, yet you did. Why?" For a long moment, Elias said nothing. His hands stilled on the tool, his eyes fixed on the fire. Maria thought perhaps he would ignore the question, as he had done with others before. But then, to her surprise, he spoke slowly, carefully, as if choosing each word with great thought. "I know what it is," he said quietly, "to lose someone." Maria's heart skipped. She leaned forward slightly, listening. "I had a wife once," Elias continued, his voice low but steady. "Her name was Lila. She was gentle, full of laughter. She loved the earth as much as I did. We built a small life together, not rich, not easy, but full of peace." Then, he paused, swallowing hard, as though the words carried weight too heavy for one man. "One winter, she fell ill. The fever came quick and strong. And before I could do anything, she was gone." The firelight flickered across his face, and Maria saw the deep shadow of grief in his eyes. It was the first time she had seen such emotion break through his calm exterior. After that, Elias continued softly, "I could not bear the sound of voices, the laughter of others, or even the kindness of neighbors. I withdrew. I worked my land, not because I loved it anymore, but because it was the only thing that gave me a reason to rise each morning. Silence became my companion. It was easier to be quiet than to speak of what hurt." Maria's eyes stung with tears. She lowered her sewing, her hands trembling. She had never imagined that behind Elias's silence was a story so much like her own. He, too, carried the weight of loss. He, too, had buried dreams with someone he loved. "I didn't agree to help you because I wanted anything in return," Elias said, his voice almost a whisper. I agreed because I understood. I saw the same struggle in your eyes that I once carried. And I couldn't turn away. Maria sat in silence, overwhelmed. For so long, she had felt alone in her grief, believing that no one could truly understand the depth of her loss. Yet here was a man who had walked a similar path, who had known the same kind of pain. It was as if their unspoken sorrows had drawn them together. She wanted to say something, to comfort him, to thank him. But no words seemed enough. Instead, she reached across the small space between them and placed her hand gently on his. Elias looked at her, surprised, but did not pull away. For a moment, they sat like that, two broken hearts sharing a quiet connection. The days that followed felt different. Though Elias did not suddenly become a man of many words, Maria sensed a change. His silence no longer felt like a wall, but like a shelter, something that held space for both of their griefs. They began to share small things, memories, thoughts, even small smiles. One afternoon, as they worked side by side in the field, Maria found herself telling him about Aaron, about his humor, his love for singing while working, his dreams of planting more orchards. Elias listened without judgment, without interruption, simply allowing her to speak. Later that evening, Elias told her about Lila, how she had loved flowers, how she used to hum while kneading dough, how she dreamed of filling their small house with children. For the first time, they shared their pasts, not as a burden, but as a way to keep their loved ones alive in memory. Maria began to notice that the silence between them had changed. It was no longer empty or uncomfortable. It was full of understanding, full of unspoken respect, full of something tender she couldn't yet name. One night, as the wind howled outside and the house creaked under the storm, Maria felt a strange sense of safety with Elias nearby. She realized that she no longer thought of him as just an arrangement, a name on a piece of paper to protect her land. He was becoming a part of her life in ways she had not expected. She lay awake that night, thinking about the path her life had taken. She had once believed her story ended with Aaron's death, that all she had left was a fight to protect the land. But Elias's presence had shown her that life could hold more than loss. It could hold second chances, quiet, unexpected, and gentle. Maria knew she still carried her grief, and always would. She knew Elias carried his too. But perhaps that was the reason they understood each other so deeply. They were not trying to replace the ones they had lost. They were learning how to live again, side by side. And as she drifted to sleep, Maria realized something she had never expected. What had begun as a desperate arrangement to save her land had become something more. She no longer felt like she was walking through life alone. The seasons turned, and life on the farm moved forward in a way Maria had not expected. What began as a desperate arrangement to save her land had quietly transformed into something that felt natural, almost ordinary. The neighbors no longer whispered about her being a struggling widow. They spoke instead of Maria and Elias as though they had always been a pair, two people who worked side by side, tending the fields, raising animals, and sharing the simple burdens of daily life. At first, Maria found it strange how easily people accepted them as a couple. But in time, she realized that appearances mattered less than the truth she carried in her heart. And the truth was this: Elias had become more than a name on paper, more than a quiet presence in her house. He had become a part of her days, a steady strength she leaned on without even realizing it. The farm began to flourish again. With Elias's help, the work no longer felt impossible. The fields were plowed more quickly, the fences held strong, the animals thrived. There were still challenges: storms, pests, the endless unpredictability of farming, but Maria no longer faced them alone. Each hardship felt lighter with Elias by her side, his calmness steadying her when worry threatened to overwhelm her. One morning in early spring, Maria stood at the edge of the orchard, watching the blossoms sway in the breeze. The sight filled her with both joy and longing. She remembered how Aaron had always dreamed of planting more trees, of filling the land with fruit that would feed generations. For years after his death, she could not bring herself to take that step. It felt like something she should have done only with him. But now, standing there with Elias working quietly in the field nearby, Maria felt a shift in her heart. Perhaps it was time to plant again. That evening, as they shared a simple meal, Maria spoke. "Elias," she said softly, "I've been thinking. I want to plant more trees in the orchard. Aaron always dreamed of it. I think, maybe we could do it now." Elias looked at her, his expression unreadable at first. Then, slowly, he nodded. "We will," he said simply. The following weeks were filled with preparation. Together, they dug the soil, set the young saplings, and watered them carefully. Maria felt both sorrow and hope as she worked, the sorrow of remembering Aaron's dream, and the hope of finally bringing it to life. She noticed how Elias treated the trees with quiet reverence, his hands gentle as he pressed the earth around their roots. It was as if he, too, understood that these trees carried more than just fruit, they carried memory, healing, and promise. As the orchard grew, so did the bond between Maria and Elias. Though they still spoke little compared to others, the silence between them had become rich and full of meaning. Maria found herself looking forward to his presence, to the small moments that revealed his care, the way he would leave a cup of warm tea for her after a long day, the way he covered the animals before a storm without being asked, the way his eyes softened when she laughed, rare though her laughter was. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Maria found herself sharing something she had not spoken aloud before. "When Aaron died, I thought my life was finished. I thought all that was left for me was to hold on to this land and survive. I never imagined this." She gestured around the room, at the quiet home they had built together. "I never imagined someone like you would come into my life." Elias was silent for a long time. Then he said, "I never imagined it either. But, sometimes, the earth gives us a second harvest, even when we thought the season was gone." His words lingered in Maria's heart. She realized then that Elias did not need to say much. When he spoke, his words were like seeds, few, but full of meaning, planted deep in her soul. Time passed, and the orchard grew strong. The villagers began to admire the sight of the young trees, saying Maria and Elias had breathed new life into the land. Maria felt proud, not just for herself, but for both of them. The farm was no longer a place of sorrow alone. It was becoming a place of hope, a place where the past and the future could meet. One late summer evening, after a long day of work, Maria and Elias sat outside, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of red and gold. The air was warm, the crickets had begun to sing, and the fields stretched out before them, glowing softly. Maria turned to Elias, her heart full. "This was supposed to be pretend," she said quietly, almost to herself. Elias looked at her, his brow slightly furrowed, as though waiting for her to finish. "But it doesn't feel pretend anymore," she continued. "At least, not to me." For a moment, she feared she had said too much. But then Elias reached over and took her hand, his rough, calloused fingers curling gently around hers. "Not to me either," he said simply. Maria's eyes filled with tears, but this time they were not from sorrow. They were from the quiet joy of realizing that what had begun as desperation had grown into something real, something neither of them had expected, but both had needed. From that day forward, Maria no longer thought of Elias as just her arrangement. He was her partner, her companion, and slowly, quietly, her heart began to accept the possibility of love again. Not the same love she had with Aaron, because love can never be repeated in the same way, but a new love, one born from shared silence, shared work, and shared healing. As the orchard blossomed and bore its first fruits, Maria felt as though her own life had blossomed again. The land was safe, the future was steady, and her heart, though scarred by loss, was learning to beat with hope once more. And so, the young widow who once feared losing everything discovered that life had given her more than she had imagined. She had saved her land, yes, but in the process, she had found something far greater, a man whose silence spoke louder than words, a companion who understood her grief, and a love that had grown slowly, like the orchard they planted together, strong and lasting. Maria realized, with quiet certainty, that the story of her life was not ending, it was beginning again.